King safety is the most important strategic theme in chess, at least the one that you need to be the most careful about. Because you can have a beautiful pawn structure, but if you get mated, the game is still over. Nigel Short once said, "I don't know why people worry about pawn structure so much, because checkmate ends the game." Okay, guys, how's everybody doing? Good? Excellent. So we're going to be talking about strategy, and what I thought I'd start with is a blindfold simul that I gave earlier this afternoon. It was 10 boards, and there were actually a couple of interesting games that I think are going to provide a good segue for us to start talking about actual strategy that can translate into tournament games. But first of all, you know, I don't know if any of you have ever tried playing blindfold or doing blindfold simuls. It's a pretty interesting experience, and it's one that I started investigating and trying to perfect because I thought it captured the essence of chess for someone who knows absolutely nothing about chess. You know, imagine somebody just walking by the street, doesn't know what a knight is, let alone how it moves. If he sees someone that's blindfolded playing against 10 people at the same time, he's going to get it like right away. Like that, there's something interesting about it. There's something that goes beyond simply looking at a board and moving around some pieces. So I, of course, just started playing with one opponent, and then when I figured that wasn't a problem, I went up to 2 and 3 and so on, and the most I've done is 10, which is what I did today. And there are a couple of interesting tips that I learned from a very good book called Blindfold Chess, and that is to break up the 10 boards, for example, into little groups. For example, my first 4 boards, I played e4 as white. Boards 5 and 6, I decided to play with the black pieces. And then boards 7 through 10, I played with white, but I played d4. So actually, I'm not playing 10 boards. I'm playing one simul where I played e4 on 4 boards. So I have 4 boards over here. I'm playing black on 2 boards over there. And then I'm playing white, but I played d4 on the other 4. So instead of juggling 10 random games, I actually have 3 ordered groups, and I can always just dig into each group, and that really does ease the task. In any case, I wanted to start off with this game. This was one of the games that I played with black. Here you can actually see the name of my opponent because I committed the oversight of not asking all of my opponents to write down their names before we got started, so probably the next couple of days I'm going to be name hunting and trying to find out who I was playing. But anyway, like I said, I was playing black in this game. I'm going to go through the opening fairly quickly because it's a fairly standard opening, and the idea is to talk about strategy today. Although, as we'll see later, I think that strategy and the opening are very closely related, and if you're smart about it, you can actually set up a very comfortable game if you're familiar, not necessarily with memorizing opening theory, but with just some general principles that can guide you from the opening all the way throughout the game, probably till the end game. Anyway, so this is a dragon Sicilian, and now my opponent played this move, bishop c4. Let's start off with the widest possible division we can make in terms of strategy in chess. Yeah?
This was my game, so I know the moves.
This was your game?
Yeah.
What's your name?
Addy.
All right, 9 to go. I got one. All right, so we're going to be going over this game. Excellent. And don't leave without giving me your full name, because I want to type it up on the file. So like I was saying, we're going to start talking about strategy. Let's make the first really big division. Chess is divided into strategy and tactics. strategy involves all our long-term planning, while tactics involves immediate capitalizing on our opponent's mistakes or vice versa. So what we're going to be talking about today is just concepts that are going to make our life easier as the game goes along, even though we can't really appreciate it in the short term. So if chess is divided in strategy and tactics, I think that all games that are lost can be traced back to a tactical blunder or a strategic blunder. Tactical blunders are easy. I mean, we make them all the time. You know, we're playing blitz, we hang a knight, it's over. We hang checkmate, it's over. We hang the queen, it's over. Those are tactical blunders, and they're the easiest to appreciate. But sometimes we don't make tactical blunders, and we lose anyway. And we get this feeling of not really knowing what went wrong, because there's no visible, grotesque mistake, yet we lose anyway. And it seems like we lost fairly easily, too. And that is usually because of strategic blunders. And strategic blunders are much harder to perceive. And that is what I wanted to talk about today. Now, bishop c4 is considered a dubious move. I wouldn't call it a strategic blunder, but as we'll see, it handicaps white's position from very early on in the game. The normal move white usually plays here is f3, which leads to the Yugoslav attack, or bishop e2, which leads to much more positional gain. But both f3 and bishop e2 share the common trait that they prevent the move knight g4, which bishop c4 does not. So now after bishop c4, black has this very unpleasant move, knight g4, which is basically going to cost white his bishop pair. During the game, I was wondering, well, what would happen if something like bishop g5, and here I started analyzing moves like queen b6, which look pretty annoying because this knight on d4 is hanging, we see the pawn on b2 is also hanging, and the pawn on f2 is under serious pressure as well. So it doesn't seem like we can move the bishop away. The other alternative would be to play a move like queen d2, so that against knight takes e3, white can play queen takes e3 and at least keep his pawn structure intact. And I think this is actually what white should have done. But in the game, Adi, right? You played castles here. And I think this is what I would call a strategic blunder, because it's a move that you're not going to lose any material, but what's going to happen is your position is going to reach its peak very, very early on in the game. Because after knight takes e3, f takes e3, you've lost two major strategic advantages. You have an advantage in development. So that's absolutely true. I mean, you've developed all your pieces, you castled your king, you opened up the f-file, that's very nice. But you've lost two very important elements in your position. The bishop pair, and you've taken on a very bad pawn structure. What we have here on e3 and e4 are the dreaded doubled isolated pawns. Probably the weakest kind of pawn structure you can find in chess. So anytime you can avoid this kind of pawn structure, you definitely should do it, because even though it might seem like you'll get to create some threats and maybe some initiative on the king side, particularly along the f-file, you're basically forced to give checkmate or suffer for the rest of the game. And looking at this position, I really don't think that white has a powerful enough initiative to go for checkmate. So when you give up two strategic elements like the bishop pair and the pawn structure, you need to have something very, very real for it. because what's going to happen now is that white's position is going to go slowly downhill, even though you haven't made any tactical mistakes. So let me just go on and show a few more moves of how this game went, and then I'm going to turn to another game played in the simul. So castles, queen f3, e6, and already we see that in 2 moves, black has basically neutralized the most dangerous aspects of white's position, which are the bishop on c4, which is putting pressure on f7, and pretty much the f-file as well, because once black is castled, the rook on f8 protects f7, which can later be overprotected by queen c7. So I think that already this is a very bad position for white. So after rook d1, there's definitely some ideas to put pressure on this backward pawn. So a6, queen g3, queen c7, bishop b3, knight d7, knight f3. And after knight e5, black makes it just in time to stop the last threat on his position, which is the pawn on d6. And the game went knight takes, bishop takes. And I would like to stop here because I hope that everybody can more or less appreciate that black has a big advantage here. We see the better pawn structure, we see the bishop pair, we see a minor piece on a central outpost, another element of strategic importance here, and an outpost that cannot be readily challenged by white, because white has a light square bishop that's not looking too great because it's running into black's pawn chain, and this knight on c3, which in the Sicilian is usually white's nightmare. It's going to take this knight a long time to get to challenge this bishop on e5. So do we have any questions so far about strategy versus tactics, strategic blunders versus tactical blunders? I hope that with this game, we get a clear idea of what a strategic blunder looks like. So the blunder wasn't bishop c4. Rather, it was allowing knight takes e3, forcing f takes e3. This one's going to be a little bit more complicated. So in this game, I was playing with white. And I'm going to go, again, through the opening fairly quickly. And now, after h4, what would you guys play with black here? Let me propose 2 moves. g4 and bishop h6. Which one would you prefer and why? Yes, sir?
G4. Because if you play bishop h6, h takes g5 would give you isolated double pawn and an isolated pawn.
Beautiful. Yes, sir? Yeah?
Same.
Same thing? Anybody else have any other ideas about this position? Well, that's absolutely true. So during the game, I was only considering g4, which I was intending to meet with knight g1. And what about now? It's clear that if white gets to capture the pawn on f4, he's going to have a very good position because black's king side is completely wrecked. Yep, in the back. OK, bishop h6, defending f4. And if I go knight e2, queen a5. Oops, that's not legal. Any other suggestions?
F3.
OK. But f3 is really not going to make things that much better, right? Because, yeah, I mean, it gives the pawn back. So that's the good news, that you're not going to be down a pawn. The bad news is that your position is going to be terrible anyway. Because let's say after bishop takes e2, again, let's take a tally of what are the strategic trumps for each side. So what does white have in his favor here?
Bishop pair.
Yeah, the bishop pair is the most obvious. What else? Yes?
The more developed
Okay, so he has an advantage in development. That's true. In the back?
Black cannot castle.
Right, black cannot castle, so king safety is going to be another important strategic factor here. What can black say that, you know, to his advantage? Yeah.
He has more pawn islands.
He has less pawn islands,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so, okay, you know, if we're trying to be nice and say something nice about black, we could say he has less pawn islands, and that would be true. But still, I mean, the position, it doesn't seem like less pawn islands makes up for, you know, white's bishop pair, his development, the king, specifically the king safety. King safety is the most important strategic theme in chess, at least the one that you need to be the most careful about. Because you can have a beautiful pawn structure, but if you get mated, the game is still over. Nigel Short once said, "I don't know why people worry about pawn structure so much, because checkmate ends the game." And there's certainly some value to that, because it's easy to overvalue your pawn structure and maybe underestimate an opponent's attack. So pawn structure and king safety should be constantly weighed, because it's not like one is more important than the other. You really need to have a good balance between the two. Was anybody raising their hand? Okay, no? So after g4, knight g1, I was thinking that there could be some problems after bishop h6, knight e2 if black tried to do something like queen e7. But then I'm not forced to really capture on f4 yet. I think I can go d4. And overall, it seems like white has good chances of getting this pawn on f4 back. Still, I think black should have tried going for something like this. In the game after h4, black went bishop h6. And I think this is also a strategic blunder. Because after h takes g5, bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, how would you guys evaluate this position? Is white better? Is black better? Why? Yeah.
White's better.
Why is white better?
Yes, it's a bishops. Black's pawn structure is real.
Okay, what about white's king safety? Is it better than black's?
Not necessarily, but it's still easy to cast the queen side.
You're a couple moves away from castling queenside, and black is threatening queen g3 and checkmate. So black is threatening mate in 2.
So it's queen to f3 for white. Right.
Oh, but then e5 is hanging.
What is hanging? Oh, e5. Then bishop e5.
So it's one of those cases where it's very easy to put too much weight on pawn structure and bishop pair when we pay absolutely no attention to king safety. And king safety is a major theme that we should always at least be evaluating it and asking ourselves, who has better king safety? Are there any threats to my king? These seem like obvious questions, but sometimes it's easy to get too excited that we have the bishop pair, that we have a better pawn structure, that we completely forget about our king. So it turns out that black has 2 threats here. Queen takes e5 and queen g3. Which one should we stop? Yeah.
Queen g3, so you play queen f3, and after queen takes c5, you can play queen e2 and trade.
Ah, excellent. Did everybody hear that? So we need to stop queen g3. This is just a very nasty threat, because if we go queen e2, thinking that we defend e5 and also against queen g3, we can go queen f2, which would be very nice. We're going to run into probably bishop g4 here. And this is not going to be helping us too much. So there's no need to despair, because once we've taken a tally of the pluses in our position, bishop pair pawn structure, and we've recognized the dangers of our king safety, we can actually use one of the most powerful tools that strategy has to offer us, which is compensation, justifying a material imbalance with strategic advantages. So, I'm sorry, what was your name?
Iris?
Iris. So what Iris suggested is exactly that. With queen f3, we stop the most important threat of queen g3. And of course, now bishop g4 doesn't do much for us because we can just go queen takes f4. We get the pawn back. We protect e5. And we retain all of our advantages. So black is basically forced to go queen takes e5. And here is the really difficult move, queen e2. These are some of the hardest moves to find in chess because it's just simply tough to visualize your pieces moving backwards right after you move them forward. We have this built into our chess DNA of always trying to push forward. So moves where you're retreating, especially right after you've advanced, are counterintuitive. But queen e2 is a very strong move because in the game, my opponent played f6, hoping for queen takes e5. Of course, we're not going to do that. Bishop takes f4, queen takes, bishop takes. This is a very unpleasant endgame for black. Black has an extra pawn, but he has a completely shattered king side, two isolated pawns on h7 and f6. Also, white is threatening to capture on c7, so there's an immediate threat that needs to be dealt with. But white also has the bishop pair and some open files for his rook. The rook on h1 is already enjoying a very active file, and the other rook can come to b1 and maybe combined with ideas like a4, a5 create pressure as well. So the positional, this is usually called like a positional pawn sacrifice, is a very important tool in strategy. And you not only have positional pawn sacrifices, you have exchange sacrifices as well. And you have players like Ulf Andersson or Vasilin Topalov who use this tool constantly. I mean, if you sort through the games of Ulf Andersson, even though he's considered one of the positional masterminds of all time in chess, you would not think that he would be sacrificing a lot of exchanges, right? We usually associate the exchange sacrifice as, crazy tactics and finding a forced variation, but it's actually an important strategic tool. And the fact that you find it in the games of Ulf Andersson, I think, is proof of that. So the game went c6, bishop f3, castles, king d2, and eventually I ended up winning the game. I combined ideas of putting pressure on both sides with rook h4, perhaps trying to play rook h1, but also, well, I'll just show you how this worked out so you get an idea how to combine play in both flanks, which is one of the main advantages that the bishop pair can offer you. Once you have the bishop pair in an open position, it's very easy to shift from one flank to the other. So rook h4, bishop f5, rook b1, b5, a4 takes, rook a1. And well, at this point, my opponent made a tactical blunder. So it's nice to see a tactical blunder just to compare it to the strategic blunders we've been talking about. Yeah? Yeah, so bishop d6 picks up an exchange. Now knight e6, bishop takes, knight takes, and we see the other rook swings over to the queen side. And all of a sudden, what seemed to be a king side pressure transforms into queen side pressure. And aside from being up an exchange, white is also going to win the a7 pawn and probably trade rooks into a completely winning endgame. Okay, so I'm going to stop this game here because I think the position is already pretty hopeless for black. Any questions so far? Talked about tactical blunders, strategic blunders. Now we're talking about strategic tools. In this specific case, the pawn sacrifice. And how we should always be balancing pawn structure and king safety. It's no good to have a perfectly safe king and a completely shattered pawn structure, or a perfectly healthy pawn structure and a completely exposed king. We're going to run into trouble one way or the other if we're lacking in one of those two departments. Now, what I would like to do, and something that I already hinted at when we were getting started, is to illustrate this very close relationship that strategy and opening preparation have. Because one of the main mistakes I see people make when they study openings is that they'll simply pick an opening that their favorite player will play, or an opening that's just very popular at the moment, and not necessarily play an opening that comes naturally to that player, an opening that is easy to understand, where the idea is straightforward. And I think that should be the #1 priority when it comes to choosing an opening that you're going to invest time in and energy in, especially if you play tournaments. So I wanted to start with the French defense advanced variation. So c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, a3. Has anybody ever seen this position before? Oh man, okay. How about over there? No. What's your name? Yeah, so you play this with white or with black? You play this with black, and what do you usually play in this position?
D7.
Bishop d7, that's a move. Why not? What are some other moves here that you guys have played? Yeah? I told you I'd get to you. No, I'm talking to you. You're saying, what were you saying? C4? Okay, anybody else? In the back? F6, definitely. A key move in the French defense. Anybody else? Okay, so we've mentioned 3 very important moves. I think also knight h6 is considered to be the main line these days. But let's try to understand a little bit what white is trying to do, and then according to that, we can choose our strategy. So in the advanced French, usually white used to play bishop e2. But then he started running into some trouble. After c takes d4, c takes d4, and knight h6. Because it turns out that this d4 pawn is an important target for black. And it's not so easy to protect this pawn, because we can't really go bishop takes h6 because of queen takes b2, and we're going to be losing some material. And we can't castle, which is the most natural move we could play, because after knight f5, we simply lose the pawn on d4. There's nothing to be done here. Yeah?
Doesn't white usually play knight c3 instead of castle?
Yeah, absolutely.
Knight a5.
Yeah. So I was just mentioning like the 2 moves that white can't play that are maybe the most obvious. But knight c3 is the main move. And what's your idea after knight f5? How are you going to solve this problem? Knight a4. Okay. And if I go queen to a5? Knight c3 back, and after queen b6?
You get that draw.
Yeah, or you get a very unpleasant king f1. Okay, maybe. What's that? Why did she play king f1? Wait, king f1 where? After here, king f1?
Bishop d4 check.
Yeah?
King f1, yeah. I've lost the king.
You've lost this with black?
Once.
once? Well, I mean, it can happen. I'm not sure what the theory is on this, but I would be a little bit nervous. Like, what happens if I just go queen d8? What's that? h4 or maybe g3. And if I castle, suspect you're going to go king g2. And now maybe f6. I suppose this is playable, but I also get the impression that black is going to be doing pretty okay. In any case, this is the main line. If you ever want to play bishop e2, you have to know this idea of knight c3, oops, and knight a4. So it's not doing the arrows. But one day, a player with white came along, and he said, well, you know what? I don't like putting my king on f1 and then allowing black to play f6. So I'm going to try to solve the problem of protecting d4 in a different way. So that if you go knight h6, I can go b4. And now after takes, knight f5, I've taken care of the main problem in white's position, which is protecting the b2 pawn. Since this queen on b6 has two purposes, right? Putting pressure on d4 and b2. So now I can defend d4 very easily. I can defend with bishop e3, or I can even defend with bishop b2. Of course, this is a very theoretical variation, but it's one that's playable for both sides. Now, there comes a moment in everybody's life where you have to choose whether to gain space or keep the tension. Generally, you should try to keep the tension. One of the most common strategic mistakes, and one of the easiest strategic mistakes to make, is to forget about the center and start gaining space. And particularly in the French defense, that can be a problem. However, I would say that's the rule. That's the strategic rule. That's what our general principle that should guide us throughout our games. But good players know all the general principles. Very good players know when they can find an exception. So in this case, who mentioned c4? You did? c4 is a move that I really like. And it's a move that for some reason is not being paid that much attention to recently. But it's a move that gains space at the expense of central tension. So we can completely forget about ever putting more pressure on d4. That is over. But nevertheless, this is a very problematic move for white. Why is this a problem? Yeah?
Because the b3 square is weak now, so we can go up.
Right, exactly. So black has created an outpost on b3. So we're not just balancing two strategic themes, which are central tension and the gaining of space. There's a third element at play, which is an outpost. So we seize an outpost as well. And I think that's what justifies this decision. That's what makes this an exception to the rule. Sure, we've given up on the central tension, but we've gained control over an outpost. So whenever you have a general principle that you're about to break, you should try to phrase it as a sentence. I have given up on the central tension, but I have gained, and there you can place your justification for breaking the rule. So in this case, we gave up on the central tension, but we gained an outpost. And it's an outpost that's easily accessible for black. We have this idea of knight a5 that's coming very soon. So let me just show you how my game continued, just to give you an idea on how once I seized the right idea in the position. For example, I seized control of the outpost. Now my entire strategy is going to revolve around that outpost and making the most of it. So I'm not going to get distracted and start attacking on the king side or anything like that. Here, I need to gain control of b3. So my opponent played knight d2, so knight a5, bishop e2, bishop d7, castles, knight e7, rook e1, h6, and rook b1. So how would you guys play with black in this position? Hold on. Hang on. Anybody in the back? Yeah?
Couldn't you play knight b3 and if he takes with the knight, play bishop a4?
Okay. So let's take a look at this. So knight b3, knight takes, bishop a4. And what happens if I drop back with the other knight? Okay, so c takes b3, but now what has happened? We lost the outpost. So an outpost is a very delicate thing. An outpost is like a flower. No, I'm just kidding. It's a very delicate thing because it can't be occupied too soon, and it can't be occupied by a pawn. Because if we occupy it too soon, we run the risk of transforming the pawn structure in a negative way. There are two kinds of move in chess that you need to be very careful about. And those are pawn moves and piece trades. And there's a third move that kind of brings it all together, and those are piece trades that change the pawn structure. So any kind of move that does any of those things, you should identify as the critical moment in the game. This game, that is going to be the turning point in this game. So knight b3 would be a strategic blunder because you're changing the pawn structure in a way that's going to impact your position quite negatively because you've lost your outpost, which was your strategic advantage in this position. And also, I would venture to say that this pawn on b3 is probably going to become weak later on. Yeah, in the back. Okay, that's a fair point. So knight c6. Let's see. Can I do something else here? That's an interesting move. Knight a5. I don't think I can do some crazy tactics here. What's that? I was looking at bishop takes c4, but this doesn't really work out because b3 is hanging, so we're just going to lose a piece. I was also thinking maybe I could go knight takes c4. So that against takes, and I defend b3, but now knight a5 turns out to be particularly unpleasant. But what I could do is simply let you get your piece back and see what happens if all those massive piece trades are going to be helpful for white or for black. So let's say I start with bishop h5. So what's that? Okay, so g6. And I don't know if I have like bishop takes g6 and queen g4 maybe. Maybe not. Or maybe yes. I don't know. All right, let's say I just retreat, and I assume you go knight a5, and now I go queen e2. So you take, and bishop takes. This seems like a fairly normal position. But I don't think that white is necessarily facing any serious problems. Of course, we're playing with black, so we already have a comfortable game. I think the result of the opening has been a resounding success for black. But I think we can actually hope for more in this position. And playing knight b3 might be jumping the gun on the outpost, occupying it a little bit too soon. So how can we strengthen our control over the outpost before we actually occupy it? Yeah?
Bishop b5 and then queen c6 and then bishop a4.
Okay, I like that idea. Definitely trying to get this bishop on a4 is going to be a big part of black's strategy. But there's a different way of doing this. And what I played here was queen c7. Can anybody see the idea behind queen c7? Yeah?
Oh, can try to gain space of queen by like b5.
Nope. Yep. There we go. Yep. So it's important not to lose track of what's really important. So we want to make use of the b3 outpost. We want to try to get the bishop on a4, which would increase our control over the outpost. And the move b5 really wouldn't help us to do this. It would actually block our pieces from ever getting to the outpost. So the idea of queen c7 is actually to maneuver the knight to b6. So let's see what happened in the game. Knight f1, knight c8, bishop f4, knight b6. Also, it's worth noticing that I'm in no rush to castle in this position. We have a closed center, which means that the king usually, in those situations, feels pretty safe in the center. We shouldn't forget that castling is a defensive move. It's a passive move. And many times, I've seen this many times, people simply castle out of habit and even castle into an attack. For example, castling kingside would be suicide for black. White is going to play queen d2, knight g3, bishop takes h6. So if anything, black is going to castle queenside. But the general principle that I like to use is that if you have a useful maneuver or a piece that you can improve, that should take precedence over castling. Again, unless king safety becomes a major issue. So when king safety is an issue, that has priority above everything else. But in this case, we see that this king looks pretty safe on e8 for the moment. I mean, there are no white pieces anywhere near this king. So that's why I had enough time to play knight c8, knight b6. So now after queen d2, castles, queen e3, bishop e7, h4, rook g8, and bishop a4 is coming. It's just a matter of time, but it's not like white can do much to stop black's plan on the queen side. So I'm simply preparing some kingside play. So bishop a4. And I think at this point, we can conclude that black's opening strategy has been a major success. But what was black's opening strategy? I mean, we just talked about an opening, and it doesn't feel like we really memorized many moves. And I can assure you there are many games that have been played up and, well, maybe a couple of moves earlier. But what did we do that made it so easy? Yeah, my opponent, by the way, is like a 2,300 player, so he knows what he's doing. Yeah.
Capitalized on our advantage.
Yeah, we identified an advantage in our position early on, and we simply drove it home. We made it so that all of our moves maximized that advantage, so that we were able to capitalize on this outpost that we have on b3. And I think that's a very powerful strategy to use in the opening. Choose openings where you can identify a target early on in the game that will allow all of your moves to flow naturally around that target. So that's why I like this c4 move so much against the advanced French, because it's move 6, and we're like, okay, b3 is an outpost. All of our pieces are going to go towards b3. We even have this, I had actually seen this maneuver, knight c8, knight b6, in I think it was a Korchnoi game. So you can supplement these ideas with your actual study. With going over Grandmaster games, you can see what are some little tricks that they use to maximize that strategic advantage that they're getting very early on. So the game went bishop d1, bishop takes, rook takes, but having traded light square bishops, any player here that plays the French on a regular basis can attest to the fact that it's a pretty good feeling. So knight a4, queen f4, rook f8, knight e3, queen b6, and again we see that all of the pieces always pushing towards the outpost. I spent a few moves preparing a possible kingside attack, but unless I saw something very clear, I really didn't lose my focus on what really mattered in this position, which was the queen side. So once the queen side is secure, then very slowly, very steadily, I can start preparing moves like g5 or f6 and start opening up the king side and create an additional theme. Usually, I'm sure you guys have heard this Dvoretsky concept, opening up a second front. So one target is not going to be enough to win the game. So we're not going to win the game just because all of our pieces are on b3. In fact, if we overdo it, we're going to realize that we can't put more than one piece on one square. And we've misplaced many of our pieces. But once we've secured b3, we can start creating some cracks in our opponent's position in another part of the board. And that's what pawn breaks are for. So in the French, the f6 pawn break is a very useful tool for that. And when we were talking about move 6 and we ended up investigating the c4 move, somebody had mentioned f6, which is also a very interesting move. And a move that even though we don't play it right away, we don't discard it forever. It's still going to be part of our strategy. The timing is just going to be a little bit different. So in this position, my opponent went a little bit crazy, and he tried to open up the queen side and follow up with this sacrifice in order to create some king safety problems for me. Now, I made, well, actually, the move I made here was knight c6. This was fine. And after rook takes b3, I made a terrible blunder and lost the game. What should black play here? Everybody sees why I can't take the rook on b3, right? OK, so that's going to be the starting point of the analysis here. If queen takes b3, queen c7, checkmate. Yeah? Takes on?
E6.
So takes on e6. Interesting. And if takes on e6, what happens if white goes something like queen g4? Yeah, then you can probably take the rook, right? And queen takes e6, king d8. It looks a little bit scary, but I think you can probably get away with it. Let's see, is there any other option? So f takes e6. Rook. Well, what I could do is rook takes b6, right? And after rook takes f4, rook takes c6 check. B takes c6, bishop takes f4. White is going to be up a pawn, but you can probably well, I don't know if you can capture on c3 or a3 right away. Maybe on c3, right? Because if rook c1, you have knight e2. Yeah? What was that? Queen d8 here? That's what I played. And it didn't work out so well. F takes c6 might work. Yeah, in the back.
Well, doesn't queen a5
You're saying queen a5? Yeah. Well, but maybe I don't have to play rook b1 against queen a5, maybe I can go e takes f7 and open up more lines against the black king. Yeah?
Against queen a5, can you play rook b5?
Ooh, yeah. Nice. Yeah, definitely. So the important thing here is first to identify what is the strength of white's position. White has a very powerful coordination with his bishop on g3, queen on f4, and rook on b3. They are all converging on the queen side, effectively overloading the black queen. This black queen can't defend everything. So we need to find a move that disrupts this coordination. Yeah?
What if I give my piece back with
Knight takes c3. Interesting. So if rook takes b6, you want to go knight e2 check. But what if I go rook takes c3? F takes e6. And can I try to go something like queen e3? Oh, wait a minute. No. Knight c3, rook c3, f e6, I can play. Can I play queen b8?
Oh.
Well, but you go king b7, right?
I know.
It actually, it's actually not help. I lose the queen. But yeah, I mean, giving the piece back and still enduring a devastating attack, I don't find it too appealing. But there's a way we can disrupt this coordination of whites, and that is with the move g5. So now, if takes, knight takes, we can simply take on g5, and now it's actually the white queen that is overloaded, because it can't really keep attacking c7. It's being threatened by the bishop, and there's no way to defend the rook as well. So after queen takes, simply queen b3, and it's game over. I'm actually a little bit curious about f takes e6 here. I was thinking we could do this, but maybe this isn't so clear, right? Knight takes c3. This actually looks good for black. Well, we can go rook e1. And rook takes e6. Yeah, this looks like a pretty good position for black. I mean, maybe we can go rook e3 and knight e5. Well, but hold on. You're getting ahead of yourself.
Oh, losing the second piece.
Yeah. So this bishop is hanging as well.
Bishop b.
b4? Okay, but now knight e5 and oops. It looks like you might have some problems on the king side, right? And also defending c6 isn't going to be so easy because you can't stay on d6 or c7 because of the discoveries.
So instead of bishop a2, we're king d7, protecting e6.
In this position?
Yeah.
Well, I think, again, probably knight e5 is going to be unpleasant, right?
Oh.
Yeah, so f takes e6 looked like an interesting move because it also aimed to disrupt white's coordination in his attack. But it looks like white has this tactic. So g5 is the key because now white doesn't have the possibility of taking on b6 because you're not winning a rook on f4, you're just winning a pawn. So if you take on c6 and take on f4, you're going to find a very unpleasant surprise when you start counting the pieces here and realize that you're down a rook. So I'm just going to show you how I ended up losing this game. I played queen d8, and after e takes f7, then I figured it out, but it was too late. Because now queen f5, queen d7 takes, rook takes b7. And even though the queens are off the board, black still has some very serious king safety problems here. This would be another case, but this time I'm on the receiving end of a strategic compensation for a material deficit. In this case, white is down a piece, but his compensation lies on my very poor king safety here. And also he has a couple pawns, which helps. So after king e6, rook e1, king f6, knight e5, this position is basically lost for black. Okay, we're supposed to run till 8:30, right? Is that? Yeah, okay, so that's basically all I have to show you today. I don't know if anybody has any questions before we wrap it up. But I'm hoping that with these games, I can get you to think about some very common, very old ideas in a slightly different way, in a slightly more integrated way, in a way that you can actually take ideas and balance them during a game and figure things out really before it's too late. Because that's the big danger with strategy. Timing is everything, and it's easy to realize things once they're too late. If you're lucky, sometimes, like I said, you lose the game and you don't even know why you lost. So the study of strategy is meant to address exactly that. All right, guys. Thanks a lot.